So I'll start my presentation now. So as I said, this session is focusing on communities and very much about integrating communities into catchment management. So my presentation, I suppose I'll just go through getting a sense of place for communities where we live and where we come from, and integrating projects and the project ambitions within the catchments, the whole idea of our sense of place within the catchment, and taking that nature-based approach to the work that we do. So first of all, just a few definitions. What is a community? Effectively, it's a group of people living in a catchment area or a geographic area, I should say. There are a number of different definitions. Culturally, we may also form part of a community, so shared attributes help us define what a community is. However, if we look at it in a broader context or in an ecological context, a community really is a group of interdependent animals or plants growing or living together in natural conditions or occupying a specified habitat. So in other words, we really are, us humans are part of the communities because we live within a landscape with all of the other ecologies. We're actually part of that ecology, and this is very important to understand. A catchment, again, there's many different definitions of catchments. I like the definition that the EPA have. It's an area where water collects over the natural landscape and flows then through rivers, lakes, and groundwater into the sea. So source to sea. So that's your catchment definition. Regards to humans and our association with rivers and water bodies in general, in Ireland, humans have been associated, I suppose, with water ever since the ice receded back in over 18,000 years ago. At the end of the last ice age, we would have arrived into this country as hunter-gatherers and then settled down in settlements sometime around maybe 5,000 years ago. If we look at the place names around the country, it's quite clear of the close association that we have with our water bodies, and these names reflect the attributes of those water bodies in the context of the catchment where they are. So if you think about, for example, the lower shore, we've Carrick and Shura, the Rock of the Shore, which is the old Irish, Carrick and Shannon, again, also from the Irish, Wexford, this is a Norse derivation, and Dublin, Dove Lane, again, the Black Pool, and Leekslip, Salmon Leap, again from Old Norse. And in the UK, the situation would be very similar, as will be across the globe, really, when you think about it. We also have, had unique communities which have established and themselves around water bodies, and two very well-known ones would be the Abbey fishermen from the lower Shannon, and also the Gairach down in the Lee, the Gaelic-speaking communities. Both of those regrettably disappeared once hydroelectric schemes were put in place. Now, our relationship with catchments has been complex. In the beginning, of course, rivers and water bodies were important from a fishing point of view and transport and so on. They still are, but to a lesser extent. And these water bodies became more and more important for, I suppose, dealing with our wastes, and also started to become more and more of an inconvenience in terms of flooding. Having said all of that, we are starting to reconnect with rivers and other water bodies, and it's important that this continues and develops. Understanding our sense of place within the catchment, we need to look at our sense of place in terms of a range of different factors, historically, culturally, even spiritually. If you think about holy wells, pilgrimages, Loch Derg, Ladies Island Lake, and down in Wexford, we do have strong associations from a spiritual point of view as well. And if you think about it, most religions have water at the center of their ceremonies. Economically, geographically, ecologically. So, where do we begin? Basically, all of the above help us frame our sense of place, and which comes into helps form our pride of place. We ran a stories competition last year during the COVID-19 pandemic at the beginning, and we asked people for their personal stories. And what we got back was, a really, really interesting study of how people feel about the water bodies and connect with the water bodies across this country. It was a very informative, and what was reflected was the uniqueness of those water bodies and those attachments. So it is important to recognize that each water body is unique for each community. From a LAWPRO's perspective, we look at community engagement in terms of many different areas. We're working with the government agencies in terms of the River Basin Management Plan, but we also support communities to try and improve their local water bodies through, for example, the Community Water Development Fund. In doing that, we promote any water project which helps to enhance water quality. We will try and support smaller projects at a site scale, right up to bigger projects where we can provide funding or match funding. But we do encourage people to take that local area context, which is important, and to be thinking about integrating that project into the larger context, or a larger project, or a catchment scale project, and so on, to be thinking, you know, broader than just the location as well, and to bring in those biodiversity and climate benefits as well. So think about the characteristics of the catchment where you're living in. The types of projects which we would encourage, everything from, as I said, smaller projects, rain gardens, for example, in an urban area, biodiversity meadows, you know, improving the environmental footprint of, say, a community sports ground, or a community centre, whatever. And then looking at the bigger projects, more catchment-based projects, such as dealing with invasive species, which you have to deal at a catchment scale. Fish now becoming more and more important are these greenways and blueways, which, if they're not done right, will cause problems. It is important to understand, have a deeper understanding of the catchment processes, and we would encourage this nature-based approach to be taken at the core and at the beginning of your project if you're embarking on one. And it's important to link in those projects where you can with other state agencies, with other communities, and so on, be thinking around that at the catchment level if possible. Issues to watch out for. We would say, look, let nature do its thing. If it's not broken, don't fix it. Nature will often guide us, and rivers can heal themselves if they're just given time. Make space for water. This is very, very important. And some erosion is good. Not all erosion is bad, so a bit of gravel coming in is important, because you need to have gravel to nourish those spawning beds for fish, etc. And when planting, only plant native trees, locally sourced ideally, because they are the ones that are adapted to the local environment. And look at what the catchment is telling you, and because this is your guide. Anglers often know this intuitively, so the catchment will tell you a lot just by stepping back and looking at it. Remember that the more diverse and the more dynamic a river is, generally speaking, the more complex and the more biodiversity it can support. And speaking of biodiversity, biodiversity will vary across a river, following a continuum from source to sea. As the river expands and as the habitats and the characteristics change, you will find that different biodiversity elements or species are supported. So if you think about the freshwater pearl mussel, for example, they have slightly different needs than, say, salmon or trout, even though they're all mutually dependent on each other. And then birds, such as sand martins and kingfishers, also require slightly different habitat. But along a river system, of course, they all have a place. So it's important that we think about this in the context of the overall riparian corridor. And this just doesn't just apply to river restoration projects. It also applies to other projects, let's say community gain type projects, such as improving an area for a community in terms of landscaping, or blueways and greenways. And at the moment, we've got a big push to develop more greenways across the country, and a lot of funding coming through. So it's important that we do these things right and plan them right. Fisheries, Inland Fisheries Ireland produced a guide there. This is for urban planning. But it's a useful way of conceptualizing, for example, how we might plan our greenways if they're close to rivers. We want to make sure that the trails and the paths, etc., are kept well back from the river, and ideally further back than what you see in this diagram here. We don't want to see footpaths on the riverbank up and down rivers, because that brings in a hydromorphological pressure and has impacts in biodiversity and separates the river from its floodplain as well. So this is important that we plan these things right at the beginning. Now, even the most non-environmental projects can be greened up, and this is just an example I just want to show you here of a project which came across our desk for the Community Water Development Fund. This is down in Blarney. It's the River Martin. The project itself was to try and fix up a path here which was become unstable. It became a health and safety hazard. The space was limited for the community group to move the path. They couldn't move the path to the left because there's a big pond in the way, and to the right there's an embankment. So the works had to be done within the footprint of what you see in front of you. However, when we came down to have a look at it, we saw, look, maybe this river is telling us what to do, and at least maybe we can try and influence and make some recommendations. This is a plan view of the original plan, which the community submitted. You can see the purple there. What was being proposed there are gabions, which are hard engineering structures. So we suggested, look, maybe to try and at least roughen it up, and bearing in mind that this path has to be stable from a health and safety point of view. But we felt, look, maybe we need to go a step further than just putting in boulders like a straight wall like that, or a vertical wall. So what we came up with in the end was basically a roughened approach to try and create a bit of variability within that stretch, minimize use of rock, and only only do the enforcement where it was absolutely necessary, and allow nature to take its course other than that, and also incorporate features for wildlife as well. So we're building this into the project as well. So this has been taken on board by the community group. And also we're looking at the possibility of using root wads as well. This will depend on the availability of root wads locally. So it's all about nurturing and working with nature really in that context. And we encourage the community group to look upstream and downstream of where the particular footprint of the project is. And in this case, this is upstream. You've got a beautiful sectioned river. There's nothing wrong with it. And in fact, it's a braided type channel. It's doing its own thing. You've got lots of willow. You've got willow herb and meadowsweet and so on. So you have some really nice plants which are associated with the riverbank, proper loose drive, etc. So you have the river functioning quite well there. So we encourage the community group to put maybe some signage there to explain to people how a river functions. One of the benefits of working with communities on the ground at this level is that you pick up other issues or potential issues as well. This is an ornamental pond which the community group had put in place not too far away from the last example I just showed you there. It was planted up a lagrosiphon, which is a highly invasive species. So our recommendation was to take that out. The community group have done that. So we've avoided the potential risk of contamination of the pond adjacent to the Martin River and for wider spread of that particular species. So there's value in having these communication discussions at the community level and avoid the potential negative catchment impacts which could potentially occur. COVID-19 has brought some opportunities as well. People are connecting more with nature, and there's an opportunity to tie projects in online. Being creative, for example, using QR codes. This is an example from the River Sure, where the community group running a festival have brought in awareness of the river around using social media in a clever way. It is important, though, that we do try and integrate not just the community projects, but also all projects and state agency projects too, to try and integrate them into the catchment approach and try and avoid damage where possible along SACs in particular. So this is something this is an ongoing conversation. We would in LAWPRO, we work with agencies around the Water Framework Directive, so these conversations are happening, and we are working on guidance in some of these areas as well. So this is an evolving area, but it's important that everything is integrated. And the DPA are also working on a framework around river restoration at the national level. There are resources and supports for communities. These are free. There's different maps online, and LAWPRO, we can provide any, support and show people how to use these things if people are interested. But there are other resources as well. Various EU Life projects, Rivers Trust, etc., also have guidance as well. So just be aware of that. There is stuff online. At the moment, we're working very closely with the leader companies and the rural development companies and the leader program to develop a bespoke training approach for local communities, which will be localized, focusing in on the community areas, looking at that local context, bringing in citizen science, bringing in projects and plans, and integrating the whole lot into a more integrated approach. This is an example of one of the pilots we're developing with Iredita Hollow, who you heard from this morning on the EIP, the Blue Dot EIP. In this one here, there's 9 locations where this training will take place. This training will take in the context of the local area. So some of these water bodies, for example, are high status areas. So the focus there will be around what high status water bodies require. And in other areas, the focus will be around, whatever is unique or special or whatever the challenges in that particular water catchment to address. So this is an evolving area that we're working on with Leader. I suppose our feedback from community groups is that people across the board are interested in water projects. This is the survey that we got back from the Stories from the Water side. These wouldn't be your usual river users. These are just general public. Over almost half of the participants said yes, they're interested in local water projects. A quarter said they're interested in public consultation, and the River Basin Management Plan, the next cycle, is coming out in the summer of this year. So please keep your eyes open for that as well and liaise with us, and we'll give more information on that when the time comes. And citizen science is also an emerging field for us. So there is opportunities to tie in with festivals, for example, Creative Ireland and that, and broaden out the messaging on the catchment approach. But as I said, it is very important to try and remember the position of or the location of where you live and the catchment you're working in, and think about that wider catchment context and the potential opportunities, and to avoid any potential impacts. And be thinking about what are these multiple benefits that these types of projects can bring, both in terms of biodiversity, in terms of the river itself, in terms of the human benefits. Can we integrate all of these, I suppose, approaches in a way that we can actually have more sustainable and better project outcomes? So finally, and in conclusion, just want to say and reiterate, look, it is important for us to understand our sense of place, celebrate what is unique in our area, think about a catchment and think about the context of where you're living. Understand that upstream and downstream thinking. So look upstream and downstream and understand that wider catchment planning is important with regards to developing projects. Look for that expert advice where it is needed. For example, hydromorphologists are experts. So if you do need that expertise, bring it into the project early on. Greenways and Blueways, apply the same approaches and principles to Greenways and Blueways. We don't want to see impacts on our river systems. So they can be designed in a way to minimize or avoid impacts. And finally, talk to your community water officer. You do have river experts out there, as also in inland fisheries and other organizations. So don't feel you're alone. There is support, there is help out there. So LAWPRO, we are here to help and support. So look, don't feel that you are alone, and understand that supports are there. Always be thinking in that catchment context and take that nature-based approach. So with that, I'm just going to finish my section of the presentation, and I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Fran. And I'm now going to hand back to you to chair the session and introduce the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So that was just to set the scene around our thinking around communities and catchments. And now we're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ruairi O'Conchuir. Ruairi has a vast experience across working on life projects, land management projects in Africa and in Ireland, and also on community work. And he works with us in LAWPRO. He's one of our community water officers covering Limerick, Clare and North Tipperary. So Ruairi's presentation is proactive community engagement for scalable river restoration. Over to you, Ruairi.
Is that sharing there, Fran? Is that sharing there, Francis?
Sharing. Can you put it on presentation mode?
Yep. So thank you, Fran, and great that you managed to stay on time, so fair play to you. So my presentation is focusing on proactive community engagement for that scalable scale of river restoration. And I suppose I just want and Catch and Mark and Fran, and I have this map here, a streamscapes map, Éire Tír na Haibhneacha, and I just think it's a stunningly beautiful map, which highlights just the beauty and the sheer scale of our rivers. So what I want to touch on is how we see our rivers, how we perceive our rivers, and how we understand river restoration. I want to talk a little bit about principles and techniques. I want to talk about proactive community engagement, some of the challenges we're facing, and then some few recommendations. So how we see rivers, how we perceive rivers, and how we see river restoration. I think we all know that rivers and their features in Ireland, in an Irish context. So river water quality is key to this. It's not the only aspect, but it's certainly key, because good river water quality supports a large variety of plant and animal species. And when we consider a river, as Fran said there, we're not just looking at the river channel, we're also looking at the hydrological floodplain and the bank elevation level. So we want to consider a number of aspects in terms of the topographical floodplain when we look at a river. A river, as you know, back to your Leaving Cert days, is a natural process of deposition, erosion. So when we look at river channels, we also need to look at man-made processes within a river. This is a site that IRD Duhallow will know, that Hamish will know. Actually taken on a site visit with Hamish there last year. And again, we need to look at what barriers, what man-made features are in a river, and what impacts, what resulting impacts occur from that. But it's not just about water quality, it's all dynamics of the river, and it's about the impacts on river biology. So there's multiple features at play. And how we see rivers is quite easily captured in this image here. So within this river, this is the Newport River in Tipperary, you can see multiple important features. You can see riffles, you can see glides, you can see gravel bars, you can see a very nice riparian zone, you can see trees in the water, you can see dense bankside vegetation. They're all critical, they're all important. They support a healthy river ecosystem, and to have them in a river adds to the complexity, the biodiversity complexity, and the overall complexity of that river. So what do we see and what processes underpin natural river restoration techniques? So again, this is a river corridor. It's a wildlife corridor. It's a corridor for bats, a corridor for animals. It's connecting land and water. But there's multiple processes at play here. There's the continual sideways movement of river channels, as I said, by erosion and deposition. There's the connections of water, sediment, organic material between rivers and their natural floodplains. And then there's the connections between water, sediment, upstream and downstream, as Fran mentioned there. And then there's the beauty of the actual riparian zone itself. Again, this is a lovely feature. The top end of it has the Lower Shannon SAC, and this is looking down the Mulcair River down towards Anacotti, village of Anacotti, as it continues down. And again, there's multiple factors at play here. So what we see there is, if you like, the river, the riparian zone, but we also need to understand what's happening underneath the water, the surface water, what's happening in terms of flow and the different flow dynamics, the lamine's impact on what we can and cannot do within a river. So it's very important when we look at river restoration principles and practices, it's very important to have a planned approach. It's very important to work with natural processes, but incorporate good science and catchment-based science into our work. And we need to look at problems and solutions. So focus on solutions and sharing experiences. And if you like, communicating best practice. It's very important that we address perceived perceptions of what river restoration is all about. There's a fear often about river restoration, so it's important to address that also. So there's some of the prints here of the Mulcair River. I hope my connection is okay. There's an image here of the Mulcair River, and what's possible here. Again, it's about the options we have. This is the same photograph, slightly enlarged, and you can see, again, back to your Leaving Cert days, old oxbows within the river. So how can they be reconnected to the river? How can those important habitats be joined up in terms of the river, a drained river? But that's critically important, to look at those natural processes. What you need to get right, obviously you need to get your supporting documentation in place. If it's an SAC, you need to get your planning, your permissions, you need to get site-specific permissions, you need to get funding, you need to get environmental assessments, you need to get external advice. Start early and engage. Some of the key recommendations in terms of proactive community engagement that I'd certainly have is you need to build partnerships. You need to look at the multiple benefits. You need to look at scale. You need to look at how integration can occur. You must be ambitious, but you also must be realistic in terms of targets. It's critical that when you're working either at a local sub-catchment level or at a catchment level, you work according to the capacity of the parties involved. So you work with the abilities and the capacities of the parties involved. But it's all about building capacity, and I'll touch upon this a little bit later. It's about that idea of building community science, catchment science, and citizen science, and obviously monitoring the whole way through. In terms of building real partnerships, there's a whole succession of steps. It's about building, it's about identifying, it's about informing, it's about understanding, and providing best practice, providing practical advice, and adhering to best practice in terms of river restoration. It's about working with local community champions. We've heard some of those local community champions already this morning. Taking small steps. Small is beautiful. Establishing those linkages. So we've heard from people like Donald Sheehan down in the Bride project and the amazing work that's been done in the Bride EIP. So it's important to, if you like, work with local champions, work with those who want to work with you. It's important to build goodwill. It's important to regularly review work. And it's also important to listen and learn from others. So get people involved because they want to be involved. It's been mentioned already, role to play, and you need to match their skills to the role that they can play. It's important to celebrate what you can achieve. Celebrate locally, celebrate nationally. And then in terms of an overview of actual river restoration projects, there's multiple types. We've talked about some of them already yesterday and again today. I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the projects that I've been involved in. So again, looking at the Mulcair River, a drained river catchment, an important SAC, an important SPA, put in rubble mats in a 5.5-year period to provide habitat for juvenile salmon. These are in-stream measures that basically add complexity into a riverbed. This is one being installed here. So you can see the interlocking cobble on the floor of the river and the riffle on the downstream section. Almost immediately colonized by macroinvertebrates, providing food, providing habitat, and adding to the complexity of the river. So certain aspects of in-stream works. Adding stone vortex weirs. Again, this is the Ballymaccio Bridge on the Newport River. Adding random boulders, just strategically placing random boulders within a river. Adding complexity into such a river. Multiple benefits for dipper, for otter, white wagtail, or just a grey wagtail. Multiple benefits accruing there. Now, sorry, it's flipped on a few there. Preventing bank erosion, and preventing sedimentation into the river. So doing tasteful bank protection works, addressing barriers to fish migration. This is Anacotti Weir, sea lamprey passes being installed on Anacotti Weir, sea lamprey achieving passage. Taking out barriers. I loved the presentation yesterday by Alan Cullen on barriers and how work can be done. There are multiple challenges in terms of river restoration in an Irish context. You've heard of some of them already. These are some of the ones that we would have listed: forestry pressures, agricultural pressures, urban runoff pressures, habitat fragmentation, habitat loss. These are just a few images of such habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. Barriers to fish migration. My apologies now, it's the internet connection isn't great.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Would you turn off your camera? It might help improve the bandwidth.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
My apologies, Catherine, for that. So some of the challenges relate to our water quality. Obviously is a key component, and that's where LAWPRO comes in. LAWPRO is an exceptional body of staff across the local authorities, and it's a great pleasure to work with such talented and gifted staff, including community water officers, but exceptional catchment scientists across LAWPRO. We work, as you know, with multiple agencies. We work on this idea of a catchment-based approach, a collaborative approach, everybody working together. We have a series of measures within the River Basin Management Plan. We work within 190 priority areas and outside of those priority areas. But the key issue is water quality, and water quality is in decline. Our rivers, there's been significant decline in our rivers. We've lost a very significant number of our high status sites. There's been improvements in some of the lakes, and our estuaries are in serious decline in terms of their satisfactory high or good status. So in terms of overall ecological status, there are challenges there. There's 9 months left in the current plan, the second river basin management cycle. So it's a big pressure on to get improvements across the board. So finally, some recommendations. There's multiple recommendations. It's very hard to focus in on, but we need to have a better. We need to better value. Sorry, I'm just going to go back. We need to better value water and water-dependent species. We also need to build capacity in river restoration, and we need a one-stop clearinghouse. And that's critical because communities are often faced with dealing with multiple agencies. So we need a one-stop clearing, IFI, EPA, LAWPRO, the OPW, local authorities, and possibly others. We need to fund an independent Irish river restoration centre. So a river restoration centre that would support communities to undertake projects of scale while building Irish expertise. And I think that is critical. That is probably the most important recommendation that I would have. We also need to, my apologies now for the slide, we need to talk and avoid finger pointing. So there's a lot of finger pointing at the moment around water quality, around the intensification of agriculture. It's critical that we actually look at the evidence and we avoid finger pointing. It's also important that we look at multiple benefits and place a value on riparian zones. One of the easiest ways to place a value on riparian zones is to plant trees. And I would be a big fan of the whole woodlands for water scheme, but also just communities actually planting along river courses. Multiple benefits in terms of establishing riparian zones, creating buffers, food source for birds and fish, and an attraction. And it can play an important role in pollution control and flood mitigation. We need to mobilize, support and train catchment-based volunteers. And finally, we need to link environmental education programs together. So all of those factors are critical in how we deliver river restoration in Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you for that. Lots of food for thought. We're now going to move on to our next session. Our next session is a collaborative presentation by 6 community groups working on the ground, showcasing their local initiatives. So we start with the Greasel Tidy Towns, Castleconnell Fisheries Association, the Friends of the Camac, the Clough-and-Ely Angling Association, Shurecan, and Kilkenny Leader Partnership.